Welcome to the iWelcome webinar on consent lifecycle management. My name is Corné van Rooij and I'm responsible for product within iWelcome. I will be covering how iWelcome looks at the arising topic of consent and consent management and how it can act as a business, or it should not act as a business disabler, but can act as a business enabler. In this webinar, I will shed some light on that and I will show you an example on how this works. At the end of the webinar, we have about 10 minutes for questions, but the interface itself should allow you to ask questions in between. It's better not to ask them themselves. I think everybody's on mute also, so that will be difficult. Oh. iWelcome is Europe's consumer identity platform. There are many consumer identity access management players in the market, but there's none that is so clearly European from a region, focus, data residency, and local project support as iWelcome. As SaaS provider in the consumer identity space, we are that key platform that connects and protects both consumers as well as web applications offered to these consumers. As for our customers, mostly in digital transformation phase, identity has become the center of their engagements with their customers, and it also has become the guardian. That identity is now driving and supporting their business. Not that long ago, CM systems were focusing solely on profile information, social integration, and preferences. We might all recognize this kind of interfaces that are offered to us as consumers to enroll to online products and services. A terrible long list of items, some mandatory, others mysteriously ask, where it's unknown why a company would like to know that, this and what they really want to do with that information. In this form, you can see that same thing, and this was not that long ago, still a form on the internet. I haven't checked it lately. But if I need to download a manual for this manufacturer, why do you need to know my address and city? If that is not mandatory, why ask in the first place? And there's another interesting thing, and that has to do with the language here that is set mandatory. So why is Chinese or any other language mandatory for me to download any manuals? I should be able to select the ones in my language that I prefer. But things are changing because the GDPR kicked in and things like asking consent and data minimalization became necessary. And these forms will disappear as they are not compliant anymore, as well as the opportunity to collect data at the start of the customer engagement by just asking and storing it for further use. So you need to ask consent for this kind of mandatory questions that are not absolutely necessary. With GDPR, the new European Data Protection and Privacy Regulation, a lot of customer rights needed to be implemented, as well as a lot of restrictions that were dictated by law and even punished by fines if you do not comply. The CM systems needed to change their capabilities to fulfill those needs for their customers, and most did in a way or form. iWelcome was, as the European player, the first one to really implement that, including the necessary consent. So what is that consent thing and why do I need it for? Well, simply said, if you want to collect information because it will be valuable for the engagement of your business with the consumer, but you do not have to have that information to provide the core service, you should ask consent and be clear what you will be doing with that information going forward, which is called the so-called processing purpose. Normally, I always tackle on that word. You're not allowed to ask that information mandatory, as it would not be freely given. And the GDPR is pretty clear on that, if you share information and it is attached to providing a service, and it is not necessary to provide that service, it would not be freely given to make it mandatory, which makes a lot of sense. Am I still on the same? No, I should skip one slide. Sorry for that. You should not see this collection of consent as a silo in your enterprise landscape, as you will need that information all the time. You are processing personal data that is not falling into categories as contract purpose, legitimate interest, and or a few others. Therefore, it's wise to store the consent information close to or even attached to the data item itself. This is what you see here in this picture. You see the golden record in the middle where all the profile information is stored. And you see a blue block all with all kind of metadata attached to it. For GDPR, for instance, you have to have a data retention policy on all data you store the moment you store it. And the reason behind that was that companies should not store information indefinitely. There will always be a policy to remove that information after a certain time. But you also want to store the consents. And in this case, you see that as a multi-value thing attached to the data itself. By adopting a standard, in this case, the NIST 811, we stayed away from proprietary data model. Although you can change certain aspects of the data model, we likely or strongly advise you not to change the ones that are already in the NIST mentioned. If the consents are stored, you will still need to have basic lifecycle components in place. The orange boxes name a few, but there are many, many more. They are offered through APIs, as nobody's application, not even ours, touches the data store, that golden record, directly. It has to go always through the protected APIs. The use of the stored data comes in different forms. It's possible to put metadata or consent in, for instance, the assertion when the user logs in. So the web application can offer a customized environment on basis of the age of the person, if that person has given consent to use that age for personalizing the website. And if not, the website will not personalize on basis of that. So that's the front door. The moment the user comes in, authenticated, and will exchange that information. Then there's also a rear door possibility. This is, in our case, the consent API that gives any application the possibility to check consent, processing purpose that are there, and even things as document consent. That basically covers most of the storage and lifecycle. But how to collect consent and how to get consent in other applications who might have a silo for that. Collection should be done through the whole customer journey. These forms will these forms with all these fields you saw at the Siemens form just a few slides ago, these are not longer allowed. So if you want to collect more information about the consumer and you're only allowed to collect a minimum amount to provide the service, you want during that customer journey collecting more information at the right time. So you could ask consent at the right time. You could ask additional profile information at the right time. To get these consents into your enterprise landscape, you can use provisioning mechanisms, so silos will be used. Or if the consent API is not doable, you might want to offer a subscription service using a technology called webhooks to keep your APIs updated on any changes in our landscape. So consent is about storing and lifecycle, as consent changes constantly. Users can change consent, and it could be a reason that you want to change or alter the consent that was already approved by the user later on. But you also should provide it to your customers just in time. And examples of that that are real life, I'll show you later on. You should also have only one single source of truth. So an API your enterprise landscape can use to really collect and constantly check that single source of truth. And consent should travel with data where needed, so not be stored in any disconnected systems, because that will create a very difficult information management challenges going forward. So it makes a lot of sense to attach it in metadata. An example I often use to explain what just-in-time consent is using or pointing out to an application called Uber. I think we all know. When you install that application on your mobile phone, it will not ask you to use your GPS location. Not at that time. It will just install on your mobile phone and you will be able to request your first Uber ride. The moment that you select to collect, so the taxi driver, and you select the taxi driver and it starts collecting you at the right place, only then Uber pops up the message if they can use your GPS location, so the taxi driver can more easily find you. And this is really just-in-time consent. Uber knows that if they ask to use your GPS location, giving value back that is very clearly defined, then the chances of you selecting yes is a lot higher than when they do it when you enroll the application. So do not collect all information from the start, certainly not if you do not have a purpose for it, because then it wouldn't be compliant, but collect additional profile information, consent information attached to it during the life cycle of the customer journey itself. And do it at the moment that you can bring value. So the chances of the person say yes to it highly rises. Collection of consents just in time should be crystal clear for the consumer, because that's what the GDPR dictates. And that's really about communication. So when you collect consent using interfaces like the examples you see here on a mobile phone, do it in such a way that it looks like you're having a human interaction, a dialogue with your consumer. You're clearly defining what you ask for him and what he will get back from it and what you will be doing with that information. In that way, creating that trusted relationship, creating the transparency, there's a big chance consumers will add additional information, give consent when they need it, and the profile and your knowledge of the customer will grow as part of that. For enabling your digital business, you really need, at least you would like to know more about your customer digitally. And that customer should stay in contact, in control of its own information whenever they need that and maybe change it. Applications should also have access to that same information, correct information, and they should be updated when things change. So that makes it quite an easy exercise, but it means you need to have a central system in a way, shape, or form. The digital economy, however, is not interested solely anymore in your social or your digital representation. They want to really collect more about you so they can offer services that are really of your need or for your need, and you're likely to buy from them. They can't push all the options and all the offers they have to you because that will be too much of a communication. You'll probably disconnect from their service. So they like to target you, and they want to be certain that it's the information or the option that likely you really want. This is called customer intimacy, delivering tailored offerings to match the demand of that specific consumer. And basis of that, create a long-term relationship. This you can see as consumer 2.0. For that, it's likely not enough just to collect information and have the consents like you saw on the previous screen. There is a need for relationship knowledge, for approvals to do things called mandates, and other things you need to collect. But the key is that it all comes back to what you consent as a consumer, and it comes to information that you should be in control of and should be changing all the time as a consumer. They should stay in control of their own information, and it is in basic also theirs. The trait is clearly the more a consumer trusts you and sees value in sharing, the more it will disclose. Even more than with friends. And maybe that's a little awkward saying, but I have an example of that. Think of an organization within PSD2, so that new payment service directive, payment industry, that will give a digital financial institution access to all your banking information because you gave them consent for that. So they will have full transparency over your financial situation. Well, that is something that you normally do not share with all your friends when you are having drinks at a table. So this is really information that's very private and sensitive that you are willing to share with an organization because they can advise you better. And it's all around consent and trust. So how does it look to build this trustworthy relationship in a frictionless way? Because otherwise they drop out early, offering value as a way of trading to drive the stronger engagement because you create customer intimacy. So to getting you to know your customer better, to offer him or her more suitable service or product. That's the goal. As an example, I take this smart thermostat, and this is the latest model that's clear for everybody that has it. but it's a smart thermostat. It's not a smart meter. So it's that thermostat you have in the living room, which is the one you use to control your heating, but of course a modern one. The yellow bar is the customer record again. The user is enrolling its new smart thermostat and follows the enrollment process, likely using the interface on the device itself. What will happen during registration of the device, that the user is connected to that device, and that things as the relationship between the user acting as the owner and the device are put into the record or into the profile information, as well as any authorizations. Here there is an authorization put in the thermostat that basically says the owner has full control and it can manage, for instance, add users, and it can also manage mandates or permissions or approvals, just depending on what kind of device or service it is. Then there could be a pop-up on the screen of the energy company at a moment that you register maybe the users of the energy are just informing somewhere, or there's an email letter where the energy company asks you if they can use the data of your smart thermostat so they can advise you better on the energy cost in return. So in this case, they basically ask you to get access to your smart thermostat, download the data, do some processing on it, and give you back an advice. They're not asking to share it in any shape or form with others. So if you allow that, it would mean that you basically set a consent for using that information for exactly that purpose, and that consent is stored in the user record itself. So the energy company can read your profile information and knows it can read that data. You see on the right, it even get an authorization. On the left, you see the consent given, and it's all stored nicely in the profile. If then I like to have my family control that thermostat, my spouse, well, likely I will let her do everything that is possible to the thermostat. But my kids, well, you know, kids, I like them only to be able to turn on and off the thermostat. If I program that with using any interface that is offered, also that information is stored in the profile. So you see here in the middle, the relationship being set up. My wife has a different UID, so she will may also have some connections somewhere. The kids also. In the more right one, you see the mandates that are set, so the spouse can change the settings and the kids can turn on and off the thermostat. So it's clear for the thermostat, but also for the energy company in a way, if they have a management interface for it, what these settings are. Then it could be that the energy company, knowing that I already allowed them to use my data to give me personal advice, that they offer me anonymously to use that same data to share it with other people, households that have the same characteristics. They have the same type of house, square meters, isolation, family, whatever. I mean, they're talking about millions of users, so that definitely will be a group of users that is very close to my circumstances. So if I allow that, then I allow depersonalized data to be used. You see that more on the right side in the yellow. And on the left side, I give consent to that processing, and I add a permission, a mandate to collect my data. So these you see on the left, the consent ones with the processing purpose. Then, and this is a bit of a twofold thing, while doing administration on the energy website, for instance, the energy company asked me if I would be interested in any energy saving methods, because they see I use a smart thermostat. That's likely the case that I'm interested in that. So that's a good question. If I say yes to that, there is a consent stored that gives them the possibility to, I wouldn't say bother me, but come with pop-up messages or anything alike if they have something in the order of energy saving. They cannot send it by email, they cannot send it by post, but they can inform me using a pop-up, for instance, that things are happening, which you see here. So here I get a pop-up saying, hey, we have a new heat pump offer. It costs you a certain amount per month. and it will replace your central heating system and save you some money. But too much information to show you on this screen. So give us the possibility to send that information by post, just normal regular post, or by email, or maybe even both. The moment I do that, again, consents are stored specifically to send that information by email or by regular post. So that's a change you see happening there. So if you look at from a further view, you see a lot of consents were collected, and these consents are connected to data items, the email address, the normal address to be used, the UID in this case also. So the consents are clear about the processing purpose, but also clear about the data where they can be used for. You can envision that you can build an interface where you can look at, let's say, your email address, and you see that there is a certain processing purpose coming from the contractual agreement you have, which you cannot remove. And there are additional ones, so-called consents, that you gave during the customer journey that you could withdraw yourself, because consents should be as easy to be withdrawn as they were to be given. So that's a good interface to build on top of this. So if you look to consumer identity and access management according to iWelcome, it can't really be seen without consent or consent management. There are too many regulations, specifically GDPR, also the e-privacy regulation, and the PSD2 in the finance sector. And there are new ones coming up, like in California, there's a new GDPR-like law. In Singapore, there's one. In Canada, there's one. So this is really a trend that will not stop. You cannot process a lot of data without using mechanisms as consent going forward. But you want to do that in a way that is in a business-enabled way. And that means that you should stay in complete dialogue with the consumer on what you are doing. That will be building trust, and you will be asking the right questions at the right time, which is just-in-time consent. Definitely when it matters, so at the right time, showing some value in return, maybe to make it happen. You have to have the CM platform offer you these conversations at scale. As we are often talking about millions of users that are connecting and in dialogue with you anytime, any place. And you have your landscape have to have access to consents all the time. So the exact status of the consent and what they can do, as well as the consumer that should be able to withdraw or change consents whenever they like. And that makes the CM system, in a way, the single source of truth. Because PII information is stored there, but also clearly information that is only consented, so limited to a certain purpose. It's completely manageable by the user, the consumer itself, and it is usable by all the dependent IT systems that you have in the enterprise. So that system is, for that reason, a single source of truth. That's where my presentation was about, and hopefully it was interesting to hear. And there's now the possibility to ask any questions about this presentation. I don't know if the people are going to be unmuted for that, or I'm looking at, nope, they will not be unmuted. So they have to ask it using the interface. Okay, you have to ask questions using the interface. I see one from Matej. Let's see. He says, I think this is a good example, company versus friend, but is that really fair? The friend provides no value in relation to money management, while the service would get access for a specific purpose. Oh, absolutely, it's not fair. But I'm just saying that you might think that consumers are afraid of sharing information that is sensitive or private to them. But that doesn't have to be the case. Like you said, if you offer a service that is very valuable for that person, then he is definitely willing to share sensitive or other information that he is not sharing to his friends. So it's really about the relationship between you and the person or system you're doing business with. And if you have asked permission on the right way and you're a trustworthy person, you will get that information. So in a way, that was not a fair comparison, Mathieu. I got another. Oh, Mathieu is asking questions. Can you share more details regarding bundling data and metadata? How does it work technically? I'm not certain if I understand that correctly. The bundling data and metadata. So the metadata itself is on top of the data item. As such, it's like in a data store that you store some metadata, when it was changed last and by who. Only the NIST offers you a wide range of items to store connected with that data. If you want to combine data items, you have to be very careful because of these consents and because of data retention that could be on certain data that you have collected in the past. So it's difficult to, and we see that sometimes in other consent management systems, but it's difficult to group data items and make one consent on top of that. Because there are other things you need to keep track of, like the data retention, that could be different. So combining data as such, the grouping the data for a certain use is something that the system or the service needs to do, because all of these data items would have the same processing purpose stored in the metadata itself. Hopefully I answered that question for you, Mathieu, but otherwise you're happy to ask another question, or we can take it offline. Okay, you said it makes sense. Okay, that was maybe the answer on the first one. You mentioned that metadata should be co-located with data and travel with the data. Well, travel with the data is something that is much easier if the data is attached to the data itself. Because if you put it in another data store, you need to add a pointer in a way to the original data store where the data item is. It means quite some additional querying to get the data on time back to the service or the user. So if you use the front door example to get consent data in the assertion, you only have maybe milliseconds to do that. If you have to go to another data store with a pointer and get an information, get it back, return it in a way to the service to write it into the assertion, or the JSON Web Token, that is likely not going to happen in the time frame. But if that data is stored directly at the data item, it is possible to do that. Not a lot of consents, but still enough. So travel with the data is a possibility. It's not a must. Having the metadata and also the consent data directly attached to the data, it just gives you a whole load of possibilities of using that data by itself, because we store consent and data retention and other things from the GDPR in that same metadata. It's also easier to report on compliance if you have data you do not have legitimate interest on, no consent, no contractual. We have data that is basically maybe not, we're not allowed to keep that data. So it's, I think, helpful for any organizations to have that all in one place. But you could do it differently. And then are the push notification that you use for JIT questions GDPR proof? Should you have consent to ask these things in the first place? Oh, that's a good one. No, if you push a notification that is not legitimate interest, then you should have consent on that. But example of the UMA one, when you ask the GPS location, that is a question that falls under the legitimate interest. So it is in your interest as a consumer to get that question. It doesn't give them consent to use the GPS. So the legitimate interest in this case does not give them consent to use it, but it did give them the consent to ask the question. Hopefully that's clear enough, because it went quickly. Hi, Corné, interesting webinar. Thanks. What about adding mandates in the case of a smart thermostat? Doesn't it cause a lot of extra users, and is it possible to scale up easily? The thing with mandates is that in a way, shape or form, you're doing that anyway, often in the device itself. but not in a central place. So look at any more or less smart device you have, your smartphone, thermostat, your smart television. You're doing configurations, maybe family or settings there anyway, but it's all on the device itself. So the idea of the mandate is that you connect it to the identity and not in the device itself. The device could get that information from the identity, the owner connected to the device, but there's a central place that you have that stored. We call it mandate, but that's just to have a regular way of saying it's an authorization or it's an approval or it's any other verb that is applicable that is not an authorization in the IAM space. So we use mandates not to confuse it with authorizations. Is it possible to scale up easily? Yeah, that's also a good question. That of course also depends on the type of data store you use. The data store we use, we can put in almost definite data, even movies. But if you have a relational database, then there would be a scaling issue to doing that. The application would always go to the user, and from the user to the data, from the data to the metadata. And the data store we use is built just for this purpose, and we can scale up very easily for that purpose. Let me see if we got another one. I think, did I lose any? Let me check. I think I asked all the questions. Are there any more? No, I don't see anyone, but maybe somebody's typing, so I'll wait a few minutes. Nope, no one coming in. So that was the webinar then. If you have any questions coming forward, feel free to send me an email or contact us because we're more than happy to or answer directly or in our new webinars take up that specific topic. So any ideas on that, also very helpful. And then I want to thank you all for your attention and hopefully hear you again next time, and hope it was a good webinar for you to follow. Thank you all. Have a nice day. See you next time.